Ladies and gentlemen, I too would like to welcome you to our annual symposium. This truly will be unlike any other symposium, I think, in our foundation's history. My personal thanks to National Events Committee Chairman Scott DePasquale and his team for working so hard to, and with the staff to make this such a success. So thank you again. I also want to thank you, all of you, for your support for events such as this. That provide the critical resources needed by the college to educate and develop future leaders of our military and civilian joint and combined force teams. Of course, the resources required that Admiral Chatfield so eloquently outlined. One change to the program I would like to announce is the afternoon's economic moderator, your economic panel. The moderator now will be Dr. Nick Vosdev instead of Fran Moore. Unfortunately, Fran Moore fell ill earlier this week and will not be able to attend today. Also, just a reminder for cell phones. I always check mine as well just to make sure that it's on mute. It is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you this morning's keynote speaker. Admiral Harry Harris retired as a four-star admiral in charge of all military operations for more than half of the world's geography in June 2018. That same month, he was sworn in as the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea. He is currently a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. As a diplomat, he led efforts in renegotiating the U.S. Republic of Korea Special Measures Agreement and promoted American interests in South Korea. The highest-ranking Asian American in the history of the U.S. Navy, Admiral Harris took over command of the U.S. Pacific Command in 2015. He previously served as representative of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to Secretaries of State Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, and Commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. A naval flight officer, he served in every geographic combatant region and participated in several major operations, including Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Enduring Freedom, Iraqi Freedom, and Odyssey Dawn. In total, he logged 4,400 total flight hours, including more than 400 combat hours. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Admiral Harry Harris.
Thanks, George, for that generous introduction. I know that you took some risk by inviting me to speak here, almost as much risk as I took being introduced by a surface warfare officer. So let me acknowledge a few folks, including Admiral Scott Swift, Rear Admiral Joe Chatfield, Admiral Jay Donnelly over here, and Chairman Bilden, and Ambassador Judy McClellan. Senator Reid was going to be here this morning, but he delayed his visit to this afternoon, no doubt because he heard I was going to speak. So ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I have to tell you that I was apprehensive when Mitch Waldman first approached me about speaking. After all, I never went to War College, or any war college for that matter, having been on the tail end of senior officers who weren't required to do JP&E. I'm not proud of this fact. Quite the contrary, I believe it to be a deficiency in my professional upbringing. I mention it to explain why I placed such a premium on surrounding myself with senior staff who did achieve excellence at our nation's war colleges. As Admiral Spruance's biographer, Tom Buell, wrote, Spruance believed that the complete naval officer needed a familiarity with world affairs, foreign policy problems, international relations, and national government. How right he was. Educate today, serve tomorrow. So, despite my trepidation, I'm glad I accepted the invitation to be with all of you today. I'm also well aware of the fact that one of history's greatest speeches ever was given by President Lincoln and only lasted a little over 2 minutes. Julius Caesar gave what might have been the world's longest speech ever, and his best friends killed him. So let's get to it. Folks, this morning, I have the Matadors challenge ahead of me. I have to make a point over here, I have to make a point over here, and I hope there's not a lot of bull in between. So let me start by saying point blank that I believe that we're at an inflection point in history. We're certainly not near anything resembling the end of history. Freedom, justice, and the rules-based system hang in the balance, and the scale won't tip of its own accord simply because of wishful thinking. There's no better way for me to address this symposium and this year of the Tiger than to share with you my thoughts on the importance of the Indo-Pacific through the twin lenses of having commanded U.S. Pacific Command and as your ambassador to South Korea. President Reagan once said that we cannot play innocence abroad in a world that's not innocent. This statement is as true today as it was in 1914 and 1941, throughout the Cold War, on 9/11, and on February 24th of this year when Russia invaded Ukraine. The world remains a dangerous place. The unipolar moment following the Cold War is over. We find ourselves again in peer competition with adversaries who are developing and deploying cutting-edge weaponry, including hypersonics. Ukraine is ablaze, Taiwan is under siege, and North Korea is building and testing nuclear weapons. So, while our opportunities remain abundant, the path ahead is burdened by several considerable challenges, including an aggressive North Korea, a revisionist People's Republic of China, or PRC, and a revanchist Russia. And I'll speak to each of them briefly. First off, I'm sure you all have read about Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan 2 weeks ago, all the brouhaha that preceded it, and China's truculent behavior that followed it. So let me be clear. I supported her visit before she went, and doubly so after China threatened her, Taiwan, and the United States if she went. Last February, the Biden administration released its new Indo-Pacific Strategy, the bold end state being nothing less than a free and open Indo-Pacific that's connected, prosperous, secure, and resilient. It recognizes that America's single greatest asymmetric threat is our network of partnerships and alliances. In my opinion, this strategy underscores that when we work with allies and partners, give and take is preferred to slash and burn. It calls for modernizing our bilateral defense treaties with Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Thailand, advancing our major defense partnership with India, and building the defense capacity of partners in South and Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Earlier this year, the White House's Indo-Pacific coordinator, Kirk Campbell, was in the Solomons delivering a strong message about the Solomons' new pact with China. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman was in the South Pacific 2 weeks ago. I was in Fiji last month with National Defense University's capstone program, and I got back from South Korea only last Monday. The textbook case in point is almost a 69-year U.S.-South Korea alliance. Forged during a devastating conflict, it has stood the test of time. It's mind-boggling to consider how much has changed in the world in general, Northeast Asia in particular, and South Korea and the Korean Peninsula especially since 1953. Some changes have been for the better, such as South Korea's miraculous growth into an economic and cultural powerhouse, an innovation nation, a vibrant democracy, a nation that's leading by example in the battle against COVID-19. South Korea has 1/6 the population of the United States and 1/40 the number of COVID deaths. They're doing something right over there. Other changes have been for the worse. Why is North Korea so far away in Northeast Asia a challenge for the entire world? The answer is simple. Kim Jong-un's missiles point in every direction. Today, North Korea stands out as the only nation this century to have tested nuclear weapons. North Korea, toxic, despotic, erratic, is ruled with an iron fist by a brutal dictator, a man who values his pursuit of power over the prosperity and welfare of his own people. Pyongyang's unrelenting pursuit of nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them, and the North's unmitigated aggression against the South should concern us all. Folks, the U.S. stands firmly with South Korea and is fully committed to our alliance. This is important because North Korea and the PRC will continuously test the resolve of this alliance to seek ways to weaken us and to divide us. I believe that KGU wants four things: sanctions relief, to keep his nukes, to split our alliance, and to dominate the peninsula. During last year's 8th Workers' Party Congress, he talked about strengthening North Korea's nuclear deterrent. The IAEA has expressed concerns about the trajectory of North Korea's nuclear program. The United States intelligence community formally assesses that KGU views nuclear weapons as the ultimate deterrent against foreign intervention. Earlier this year, KGU declared his intent to boost his nuclear program, adding that he'd be willing to employ them broadly in conflict. That doesn't sound to me like he's going to be willing to give them up anytime soon. Now, while we hope for diplomacy with North Korea to be successful, we must recognize that hope alone is not a course of action. The quest for dialogue with the North must never be made at the expense of the ability to respond to threats from the North. So far this year, the North has launched over 30 missiles of increasing complexity, including hypersonics, as well as ICBM and submarine-launched ballistic missile tests. This is no path towards peace on the peninsula. Dialogue and military readiness must go hand in hand. Idealism must be rooted in realism. We must not relax or reduce joint military exercises just to get North Korea to come to the negotiating table. This is a fool's errand. If exercises and sanctions are reduced as an outcome of negotiations, fine. That's why we have negotiations. But let's not give them away beforehand. Deterrence by appeasement is no deterrence at all. Now, it's unfortunate that North Korea has not embraced the opportunity presented by 3 U.S. and 3 South Korean presidential summits. The U.S. continues to seek transformed relations between Washington and Pyongyang, lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula, and the complete denuclearization of North Korea, all of which were agreed upon by KGU in Singapore in 2018 and would set the conditions for a brighter future for the North Korean people. Now, while I believe that Singapore was not a perfect agreement, it's a good starting point to pursue peace on the peninsula. I also believe that North Korea missed a great opportunity in Hanoi, and they likely won't get another chance like that. Now to the elephant in the room, and that's the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. I was often asked when I served in Seoul whether South Korea was forced to choose between its only security ally on the one hand and its #1 trading partner on the other. This is a false narrative, ladies and gentlemen, designed to sow doubt about the history and the resilience and the strength of the U.S.-South Korean alliance. The U.S. made our choice in 1950 when we committed our troops to defend the South against the communist invasion from the North, as did 15 other sending states who sent troops to fight and die for South Korea. South Korea made its choice in 1953 when it formally allied with the U.S. and aligned with the West. To be clear, the U.S. has partnered well with the PRC on several important fronts. But Washington and Beijing fundamentally disagree on how to approach the current international order. The PRC does not keep its word, from its treaty with the British on Hong Kong to its human rights abuses against the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, and others, to its attempts at commercial espionage and its quest to first isolate, then intimidate, and then dominate Taiwan. As I testified before the U.S. Senate when I was in uniform, I believe that Beijing seeks hegemony, not only in East Asia, but Greater Asia and beyond. The PRC wants to set the rules for the region, indeed the world, which is why it's essential that free nations exercise vigilance. The U.S. has made it very clear that we reject foreign policy based on leverage and dominance and seek instead to base relationships on respect, equal footing, and fair exchange. The U.S. believes in partnership economics. We won't weaponize debt, striving instead to build environments that foster good, productive market economies. We encourage every nation to work in its own interest to protect its own sovereignty. And we must work in our own enlightened self-interest and develop our own reliable sources of critical materials, including rare earths, pharmaceuticals, and chemicals essential for weaponeering, independent of the PRC. Today, the PRC enjoys range and mass overwatch in certain weapons areas. Folks, we find ourselves sailing into rocks and shoals, to use a nautical analogy, and if we don't right this sinking ship, we'll lose it, and all hands aboard. I note that the Biden administration's fundamental understanding of the PRC is consistent with its predecessor. Consider the Secretary of State Blinken testified that the previous administration's tougher approach on the PRC is right, that what's happening in Xinjiang is genocide, and the democracy is being trampled in Hong Kong. Secretary of Defense Austin testified that he's focused on the pacing threat posed by the PRC, and he promised strong support for Taiwan. Taiwan is democratic, a high-tech marvel, and a global force for good. I've called for ending the 40-year-plus U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity in favor of a new policy of strategic clarity. The new Indo-Pacific Strategy specifically supports an environment in which Taiwan's future is determined peacefully by the Taiwanese. My successor at Indo-Pacific Command testified before Congress last year that the PRC could invade Taiwan in 6 years. That's 2027. We ignore Admiral Davidson's warning at our peril. Now let me spend a few minutes on Russia and Ukraine by first acknowledging the human tragedy that's being perpetuated by Russia. As Garry Kasparov recently said, Russia is committing war crimes in Ukraine on an industrial scale. Europe is experiencing a refugee crisis, the likes of which haven't been seen since World War II. And Russia is weaponizing this crisis. So, why does Ukraine matter? Well, consider that Ukraine is a democracy and the second largest country in Europe after Russia. Consider that Ukraine sent forces to Afghanistan in support of NATO, even though it's not in NATO. Consider that Ukraine sent troops to Iraq, where they fought and died for coalition military objectives. Consider that the United States, before the pandemic, conducted almost $4 billion in two-way trade in goods and services with Ukraine. And remember that in 1994, Kyiv voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons at the behest of the West. So why did Russia invade Ukraine at all? In 2 words, Vladimir Putin. Maya Angelou once said that when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Folks, time and time again, Putin has shown us who he is, and shame on us if we refuse to believe him. In my opinion, he seeks to rebuild the Soviet Union, not under communism, but to its old borders. Us geopolitical geeks have a term for this. It's called revanchism. Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Georgia, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Moldova, and especially Ukraine, of course, and others are at risk. The Baltics too, but now they're part of NATO, and that's a different nut for Putin to crack. And why now? In my opinion, opportunism. Putin saw the West as weak, distracted by the pandemic. He saw America's political divisions play out in Washington, and he watched our end game in Afghanistan. But Putin miscalculated, and stunningly so. He underestimated Ukraine's resolve. He might not believe that Ukraine is a country, but the Ukrainians sure do, and they're willing to fight and die for their country. He underestimated the former comedian and everyman who became the president of Ukraine. Vladimir Zelensky has risen to his office in truly Churchillian fashion. He underestimated the resolve of the international community to break Russia's economic backbone, and Russia may never recover. He underestimated NATO's resolve, especially Germany's. And he underestimated America's resolve to come together to support Ukraine with our treasure, our influence, and our bipartisan political determination. On the other hand, he overestimated his own strategy, a fantasy of his own making, that he could blitzkrieg Ukraine in 15 days. It's been 6 months already. He overestimated the strength of the Russian army. What we're seeing play out on the battlefield are poorly trained troops led by some very bad generals. And I'll just note that there's nothing animals like better than criticizing generals. Without adequate enabling logistics and no understanding of combined arms. It was German General Hans Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg himself, who famously said that logistics is the ball and chain of armored warfare. And it appears to me that the Russian army can't distinguish combined arms from a rock and roll band. Numbers are uncertain at best, but I've seen reporting that in 6 months of hard fighting, Russia has lost as many as 70,000 troops and at least 8 generals. And if Putin had gone to the War College, he'd know strategy lesson 1, don't lose your flagship. This is not Hungary, 1956, or Czechoslovakia, 1968. This is Finland in 1939. Russia's actions strengthened and unified, not weakened and divided NATO, the EU, and the UN, as well as brought together a divided Washington. As the Icelandic foreign minister said earlier this year, thank God we're a part of NATO, and now Finland and Sweden have applied to join NATO. The exact opposite of what Putin believed would happen. In other words, he failed and failed spectacularly, notwithstanding a certain inevitability simply because of the mass of the Russian military. As Stalin apocryphally said, and I say apocryphally because he didn't really say it, quantity has a quality all its own. Again, Finland, this time 1940. But don't be like Putin and underestimate the resolve of the Ukrainian people and never bet against the United States. George Shultz once said that he who walks in the middle of the road gets hit from both sides. I'm proud that the United States has chosen sides on behalf of Ukraine. So far, the U.S. has provided billions in aid, including key military hardware, such as Stinger anti-air and Javelin anti-tank missiles, Switchblade drones, howitzers, and now helicopters. Even so, there's more juice in that orange to squeeze. As Secretary of Defense Austin said, we must move at the speed of war to help Ukraine, even as our industrial base finds itself hard-pressed to backfill what we've already given to Kyiv. Ladies and gentlemen, do you realize that we haven't produced Stingers in America in 18 years? Finally, we must continue to expose Putin's war crimes to global audiences, including audiences in Russia. None of this is easy. But if we don't act with urgency, we'll find the outcomes more dire and the options more dangerous. Of course, Russia gets a vote, and if Putin votes with tactical nukes, chem bioweapons, attacks against NATO countries, cyber attacks on America's critical infrastructure, then all bets are off. Even Putin isn't this crazy, I hope. So this brings me to the issue of Ukraine and the implications for Taiwan. Hard to say where Beijing will land, but Xi Jinping is no fool. He craves stability in the international order so that he can shape that order in his behalf. Russia's invasion throws a giant monkey wrench into Xi's plans. The very things that he seeks to weaken, the West, the United States, the UN, our alliances with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, are coming together with Ukraine as a catalyst. While supportive of Russia, the PRC is far from all in on Russia. You can be assured, however, that Xi Jinping is watching Ukraine closely and learning. He's learning that control of the internet is absolutely vital. And I believe that he's wondering if his army is as bad as Russia's army appears to be, if his generals are as inept as Russia's appears to be, if his navy is as vulnerable as the Black Sea Fleet appears to be, and if he can first replicate for himself and then overcome the amazing American logistics machine. Unless we forget, and Xi Jinping would like us to forget, I'm sure, Xi Jinping himself and then Ukrainian President Yanukovych inked a bilateral treaty in 2013 whereby the PRC pledged to provide Ukraine with a nuclear security guarantee whenever Ukraine faced an invasion involving nuclear weapons or even the threat of nuclear weapons. And as most of you know, for years, I've sharply criticized the PRC for its lack of adherence to international rules and norms, even those rule sets that it has signed on to. So here's an opportunity to take the measure of the PRC and Xi Jinping and prove me wrong. Now to Japan. Since the end of World War II, the network of U.S. alliances and partnerships has been at the core of a stable and prosperous Indo-Pacific. No country can shape the future of the region in isolation, and no vision for the region is complete without a robust network of sovereign nations cooperating together to secure their collective interests. This is why trilateral cooperation between the United States, South Korea, and Japan is so important. It's crucial for our three nations to work together to enhance our security and preserve the international rules-based order. Notwithstanding the current tensions between Seoul and Tokyo, and these are not insignificant, the reality is that no important security or economic issue in the region can be addressed without both South Korea's and Japan's active involvement. This is why I'm encouraged by the new administration of President Yoon Suk-yeol in Korea. I'm optimistic about his outreach to Tokyo and vice versa. The stakes are too high to take any other course of action. In fact, just having returned from South Korea, let me add that how encouraged I am by President Yoon's intent to make the U.S.-ROK alliance the centerpiece of his foreign policy. I'm pleased that he places a primacy on defending South Korea against the threat from the North, which means a return to joint military exercises and an emphasis on combined readiness. And I'm encouraged by his first-class foreign policy team, including Foreign Minister Park Jin and Ambassador Washington Cho Tae-young. They're off to a great start, in my opinion. Now let me talk briefly about the Quad. That's the informal grouping of like-minded democracies, the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. I'm a big fan of the Quad. I called for its resurgence when I spoke at the inaugural Raisina Dialogue in New Delhi in 2016. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan calls it the foundation upon which to build a substantial U.S. policy in the region. I recently began calling for the establishment of a Quad Secretariat headquartered somewhere in the region to coordinate among Quad members what issues to take on, and perhaps to get at the question of how new members can join. You know, in college football, the Big Ten has 14 teams, and the Big 12 has 10 teams. There's nothing that says the Quad has to have only 4 teams. Now let me be clear. The Quad is not NATO, nor will it ever be NATO. It's a grouping of like-minded democracies who share an outlook on the region's opportunities, challenges, and dangers. But it's not a defense pact. However, the new Australia, US, UK, or AUKUS arrangement is a defensive pact. And I, for one, I'm all for it. I'm excited by it, and I cannot wait to see a nuclear submarine under Australian colors underway somewhere in the Indo-Pacific. I don't believe that it'll take decades, as some have said, if the three countries put our hearts, minds, and resources to the task. After all, we put a man on the moon in 8 years, and we developed a COVID vaccine in 1 year. We can do this. Finally, to the point in this morning's session, what to do. Ladies and gentlemen, diplomacy and diplomats matter. I, for one, am glad that the U.S. Ambassador John Sullivan is at post in Moscow. We must keep diplomatic lines of communication open with Russia now more than ever. However, I'm dismayed that the U.S. Ambassador for Ukraine was gapped for over 3 years. I'm disappointed that Australia had to wait 18 months for Ambassador Caroline Kennedy to get to post. I'm disappointed that it took the United States 18 months to get an ambassador to post in Seoul after I left. Now, Philip Goldberg is a fabulous diplomat. South Korea traded up, in my opinion, but they should not have had to wait 18 months for their only security ally to get an ambassador to post. In the Quad, we still don't have an ambassador confirmed for India. Anyone wonder why India hasn't been tougher on Russia? And it took over 5 years, you heard that right, 5 years to finally get an ambassador to ASEAN. This is on us, the United States, and it's a manifestation of the divided political landscape in Washington. Last November in New York City, I called it legislative malpractice. But to be fair to the U.S. Senate, you can't blame them if the White House doesn't nominate people in a timely manner. We can do better than this. In fact, we must. Diplomacy is hard work. Permission granted to work hard. This is juice worth the squeeze. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've done it again. I've talked too long. So, it's my wife right there, just in case you wonder who that was. So as I scanned the audience, I noticed some jittery feet and some questing for coffee. A clear tipper that I've overstayed my welcome. 2 weeks ago, I spoke at a luncheon back home in Colorado Springs. Afterward, one of the ladies came up to me and she said, "Harry, I really enjoyed your speech. I woke up so refreshed." So I'm glad that many of you still have your eyes open, or maybe you just woke up refreshed. So let me wrap this up with 3 thoughts. First, we live in an interconnected world of shared spaces. The oceans, the air, the outer space, and now cyberspace. These spaces enable the free flow of goods, services, and ideas. They are the connective tissue that binds together the global economy and, more importantly, a civil society. Access to these thoroughfares is at risk in the 21st century. Second, the U.S. made 2 flawed geopolitical assumptions last century. One, over time, we assumed that the PRC would morph into something resembling a global force for good. And 2, that Russia would no longer threaten its neighbors or the West. Today, we find ourselves shooting behind the Peking duck, and Russia and the Russian bear is afoot. We must step up our game, or we'll find ourselves outgunned, literally and figuratively. And third and finally, we have more in common, you and I, than just an interest in geopolitics. What connects us across the generations is our shared values, our shared hopes, and our love of country. Today, America remains the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. We see that play out globally every day, and in Ukraine especially today. Thankfully, our nation has always been blessed with strong women and men of exceptional courage and character. Patriots who step forward to do whatever it takes to defend America whenever Lady Liberty is at risk, to answer that clarion call to defend our nation time and time again. They serve with distinction, standing their watch in an unbroken chain from generation to generation. Our battles, our victories, indeed our very way of life, are owed not to great moments or important dates. They are owed to the actions and sacrifices of individual women and men willing to step into the breach for their country and for the cause of freedom. America is the country she is because of her heroes, past and present. People who put the nation's interest above self-interest, who put patriotism above profit, and who put love of country above love of self. Now more than ever, America needs men and women who are willing to forego wearing a business suit, forego strolling down easy street, and forego living the good life, to wear instead the cloth of the nation, to sail instead on a sea fraught with peril, to live instead a life on the ragged edge of danger, to live lives that matter. America's strength depends on the synergy between those brave men and women who wear the cloth of our nation and informed citizens, patriots like each of you who are aware of the challenges, opportunities, and the dangers that we face around the world. President Eisenhower once said, "Only alert and knowledgeable citizens can ensure the responsible use of power so that security and liberty may go together." Ladies and gentlemen, you epitomize Ike's knowledgeable citizenry. You all have what I call skin in the game. So I truly thank you for what you do on a daily basis to help ensure the viability of this magnificent war college, to ensure our military and our nation remain ready to fight and win. May God bless the men and women serving in our armed forces. May God bless the Naval War College, and may God bless America. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. You can't ask questions if you're clapping. So, thanks. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions if you have any. I'm happy not to take them. I'm happy not to take them if you have them also, just to be clear here. Okay, the woman in red is going to run the questions here. So, okay, go ahead.
Good morning, Admiral. Thank you for your time and comments today. My question's about China and specifically for the South China Sea. A couple of expressions that the Chinese are fond of using: historic rights and extra-regional actors. I don't think there are any historic rights in customary international law. And as far as extra-regional actors, given the amount of trade that flows through the South China Sea, are there really any extra-regional actors there?
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions there. I'll answer them briefly to give other folks the opportunity to ask them. So extra-regional actors is code for the United States. We are a Pacific nation, and we are a Pacific power, and we will remain so until the end of time. As far as historic rights goes, that's another code for the United States to get out of the South China Sea. They believe that the South China Sea, almost all of it, is territorial waters of China. They view the South China Sea something like we view the Great Salt Lake, as territorial water. I got into a debate one time with a PLA Navy admiral who said something like, the South China Sea belongs to China because it's, just look at the name, South China Sea. To which I responded, well, we don't view the Gulf of Mexico as belonging to Mexico, right? It's just a term that we use, that the geographers around the world use to identify the PRC, or the South China Sea. If, however, we don't challenge those illegal claims through freedom of navigation operations and the like, if we don't challenge those claims, over time, customary international law will fall on the side of the PRC. So we must challenge illegal maritime claims, not only against the PRC, but also against other countries, including our friends and allies in certain cases. But we must challenge those illegal maritime claims, or else customary international law will go to the claimant over time. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Admiral. What precipitated the failure of our policy allowing the Chinese to take over many of those islands and build military bases? Both our diplomatic corps and many of our military leaders seems to have allowed that to get away. I'd really appreciate if you'd address that.
Yeah, so
thank you.
I think that you can look at around the 2010 to 2012 timeframe as the time that the PRC began reclaiming those water features, those shallow features in the South China Sea, and then began militarizing it. And I think at the time, we took our eyes off that prize because we were focused, and rightly so, to be honest with you, on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we probably had a bandwidth issue. I don't know, but I wasn't in the Pacific then, but I think it was a bandwidth issue, and we took our eyes off the prize. But I think your question, though, is a more fundamental one, that why did we make that assumption back in the day? And I want to define that day in a moment here. When we thought that China, the PRC, would become a global force for good. And by bringing them into the Bretton Woods institutions, really, the World Bank and all of that, by bringing them into the Bretton Woods institutions, somehow they would become more like us. When in fact, just the opposite, they started to take over those institutions over time, especially the UN agencies. We used to have a policy where we felt that it was somehow unseemly to openly advocate for one country or other, or an American or other, to become the head of different UN agencies. We felt that it was the right thing to do is let the members, vote for their whoever they wanted without advocacy from the United States. How naive was that? The PRC did not have that view, and they strategically went after those key institutions at the United Nations and slowly took over them. And then here we are wondering how come things are the way they are. But even more fundamental than that was the decisions back in the 1970s that somehow that the PRC would become a global force for good. And I think that was naivete in certain respects and perhaps politically driven in others. Okay? Yes, sir. We'll grab you, then we'll grab you. Go ahead. And then we'll grab you. Okay.
Thank you, Admiral. Just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal contained an opinion piece decrying the decline of our military industrial capacity, not only with respect to shipyards and shipbuilding, of which we now have very few, but also in our ability to maintain a constant and appropriate supply of high-tech weaponry, which, as many commentators have noted, has become depleted with respect to several different types of systems as a result of our transfer of arms to Ukraine and to other NATO countries to backfill their own supplies, which they've sent to Ukraine. Given the limitations of our military industrial capacity, how do you see our moving forward, particularly in what you referred to as a speed of relevance, to remedy the shortfalls and the lack of capacity which we presently have? Thank you.
Yeah. A really great question, and you have me at a disadvantage because while you were reading the Wall Street Journal, I was trying to write this speech. Right? But let me get at it and give you my thoughts on it, even without having read the Wall Street Journal piece. As I mentioned in my remarks, we haven't built Stingers in the United States for 18 years, and it'll take about 2 years to retool that capacity to do that. But that's no reason why we should not help Ukraine today, because they're under the gun today. And if we don't give them our Stingers, our Javelins, our howitzers, our helicopters, and other weapon systems, then we're going to find ourselves fighting the Russians maybe in a different place in Europe. Because I don't believe that Russia is going to stop at Ukraine. They've already had their sights on Moldova. They've already launched missiles into Moldova. So it's Moldova next, and then we go down that list of countries that used to ring the former Soviet Union that are not in NATO. So I think we're obligated to help Ukraine. I think we must help Ukraine. We help ourselves by helping Ukraine. And I think we've managed to convince most of NATO, all of NATO, and other countries, South Korea comes to mind, to provide assistance as well. To the question of our industrial base, yeah, I have to agree with you. I think our industrial base is suffering. But part of that is on us, right? I mean, you vote for people. I'm about as neutral, independent, unaffiliated as you can be. But you get the national security teams over time that you vote for. And even with an $800 billion defense budget, I don't know how we get to a 355 ship Navy if we're going to cut 24 this year and 30 next year. I don't know how we get that. I failed math, but this is arithmetic, and I passed arithmetic. So that's a question that hopefully you'll ask leaders in the Navy today. So, okay. I think this guy, well, why don't we grab this guy, because I told him he could go next, and then we'll grab you over there. This is hard. This is hard work right up here, I got to tell you. So, go ahead.
Admiral, we've heard a lot about Australia and other allies in the Pacific region, but we haven't heard that much, or at least I haven't heard that much about Vietnam and especially India. And I was wondering if you might just share a couple of comments, especially about India and Vietnam.
So as I mentioned in my remarks, I'm a believer in India. I'm glad they're in the Quad. I called for the Quad's resurgence in 2016 at the Rasina dialogue, and then again in 17 and again in 18. I think we're all in on the Quad. President Biden's first international conference, confab, was a virtual leaders meeting with the members of the Quad, and they went after COVID distribution, which is terrific, right? So the Quad is not a military alliance. It's a grouping of like-minded democracies that look after the challenges, that view the challenges, opportunities, and dangers in similar fashion. I think India is a terrific market, if you want to talk about market, for American goods and services, for American weapons, but it's an important country, right? It's 1.3 billion citizens. By 2025, I think there'll be more people who live in India than live in China. And so it's significant. We have some issues with India. We have CAATSA, that's the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. That's a mistake in my view when we try to apply CAATSA to India. And CAATSA is all about sanctioning countries that deal with Russia. 75% of India's military hardware comes from Russia, previously the Soviet Union. So you can't expect them to go cold turkey when they face what they view as an existential threat from Pakistan. We can't apply CAATSA uniformly. I think we need to have carve-outs, and I think we have a carve-out now for India. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and I'm glad to see America's outreach to India. Vietnam, another country that faces the threat from the PRC. In fact, the last time that anybody in China has actually gone to war, it was against the Vietnamese in 1979. They got their asses handed to them. So Vietnam is a good friend of the United States. It's a partner of the United States. And when I go down that list of ambassadors, we got that one right. Mark Napper is at post in Hanoi, and I'm glad he's there. He's a good man. Okay. Okay.
Admiral, thank you for an outstanding presentation. It could be said, perhaps, that one of our greatest vulnerabilities is that we are a divided nation. China is known for taking the long view. It depends on which branch of Congress that you belong to as to how long your view is in this country, but we are a divided country. Any comments with respect to that?
So I would turn your comment on its head just a little bit and say that one of our strengths is that we are a divided country, right? I mean, do you want to be an American or do you want to be a citizen of the PRC when you don't have a choice? When your choice is limited to Xi Jinping on the one hand and Xi Jinping on the other hand. I'm not sure that's a choice. And I think over time, our democracy has lasted for well over 250 years. I could do the arithmetic here for you, but I might embarrass myself. But we've been a democratic nation for a long time. Not a democratic nation without flaws, for sure, but a democratic nation nonetheless. And we learn from our mistakes and we try to get better. I think that's a worthwhile goal, to try to get better. And you look at other unitary systems. The Soviet Union comes to mind. That did not end well. You look at the PRC, the jury's still out. They've only been around for well less than 100 years. So we'll have to see how that one goes. But I, for one, I'm proud to be an American. And I think that our divided nature is our strength, not our weakness. Okay.
Admiral Harris, Ambassador Harris, thank you very much for your thoughtful remarks and terrific question and answer segment.